Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Before we do anything, if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, turn on your notifications, and let's get right into the video. Okay, so it's Manic Monday. And today we are going to talk about the differences between bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety, and depression. Now, some of these can go hand in hand. For example, you can have depression and anxiety. You can have schizophrenia and anxiety, but each one of these has its own separate diagnoses, and we're going to get into them today. So let's start out by giving a general definition of each diagnosis. Bipolar disorder is a disorder associated with episodes of mood swings ranging from depressive lows to manic highs. Schizophrenia is a long-term mental disorder that affects a person's ability to think, feel, and behave clearly. Some characteristics of schizophrenia include intellectual deterioration, social isolation, disorganized speech and behavior, delusions, and hallucinations. Depression is a condition of general emotional dejection and withdrawal, a sadness that is greater and more prolonged than warranted by any objective reason. Last, we have anxiety, which is a state of apprehension and tension occurring in the form of a mental disorder. Now that we've defined each condition, let's break down the similarities and differences between them. We'll start with the similarities. All four conditions affect a person's mood, thoughts, and behaviors. And although depression was the only condition that mentioned isolation in its definition, all four may cause a person to isolate at some point. So for example, I have bipolar disorder and I have anxiety. So at some point I tend to retreat within myself. I isolate myself. I won't answer my phone, text, I won't answer the door. I will have certain periods of time where I just need to be by myself, where I need to be alone. So I tend to isolate. Every one of these mental conditions involves a period of isolation for some point. It may be shorter or longer depending on which of these conditions you are experiencing, but isolation is definitely a characteristic of all four of these mental conditions. Next, those who suffer from both bipolar disorder and schizophrenia experience delusions. A lot of people get delusions and hallucinations mixed up, so let's define the two. Delusions are based solely on what a person believes to be happening, whereas hallucinations are images and sounds that can only be experienced by one person. So I, for example, have and experience delusions. Sometimes I think something is happening and it isn't happening at all. Sometimes I'll feel and believe things that are happening that really just aren't. And in order for me to let go of these thoughts and beliefs, it has to be physically proven. You have to show me that I'm wrong. You have to show me that this is in my mind. You have to show me you have to prove to me that this is not what's actually happening. And without that proof, I'm still going to believe what I want to believe. And I'm not going to know or understand that I am being delusional, that I am having a delusion because it's what I truly believe in my mind. I do not, however, hear and see things that are not there. That is hallucinating. So for another example, while I was on lithium, I did experience hallucinations, audio and visual. I used to see shadows out of the corner of my eyes, and I used to hear like inaudible whispers. I did not realize I was hallucinating. I thought that I was actually seeing these shadows. I thought that I was actually hearing these whispers. And it was not until I stopped taking the lithium and then went back on it that I realized it was the medication causing these things. I know that I typically don't hear and see things that aren't there, but I didn't know that those things were not there until I stopped taking the medication, if that makes any sense. When I stopped taking it, the whispers and the shadows went away. And then when I started taking it again, they came back. And that's when I realized, number one, I was hallucinating. And number two, it was the medication that was causing the hallucinations. Continuing with the similarities, both depression and anxiety are exaggerated within the individual's mind. And by that, I mean the cause of the anxiety or depression may be rooted in something real, but the individual's suffering is prolonged because their mind will not allow them to let it go. So for example, something may happen to an individual suffering with depression and anxiety, and it may not be that serious, but their mind will exaggerate it and make them feel worse than they need to about the situation. So let's say you are embarrassed by something that you've done. If you suffer from depression or anxiety, that embarrassment will be prolonged. You will be embarrassed. That embarrassment will turn to shame. That shame will turn to sadness. That sadness will prolong your depression. So with anxiety and depression, you have something that may or may be big or may be small, but it will be exaggerated within that person's mind. Whereas when you have bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, the cause of the person's reaction may or may not always be rooted in something real. Whereas depression and anxiety, you're always going to have an underlying cause. The person is depressed because something happened. The person is anxious because something happened. Whereas with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, the cause may be in my mind. Like I may have told myself that something happened that actually didn't happen, and that's why I'm upset. And with schizophrenia, they may have seen something visually or heard something audibly that made them react in a certain way. So depression and anxiety are usually rooted in real instances and real situations, whereas schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are not always rooted in reality. Lastly, when it comes to similarities for each of these 4 mental conditions, the symptoms come in waves. And by that I mean an individual suffering from anxiety will not feel anxious forever. If you are depressed, you will not always be depressed. People who suffer from bipolar disorder are not always delusional, and those who have schizophrenia are not always hallucinating. So just because you are diagnosed with something, that diagnosis does not make you who you are. And this is more for those who are the loved ones, who are the support system for those with mental conditions. Realize that people are not always suffering from symptoms. Just because I have bipolar disorder, that does not mean I am always suffering from or exhibiting symptoms from that mental condition. So I am not bipolar disorder. I have bipolar disorder. Someone who is schizophrenic is schizophrenic. They have schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is not who they are. So when you feel that someone is experiencing a hallucination or a delusion, check in with them and ask them first before just automatically assuming that they are experiencing a symptom. Now let's get into some of the differences between these conditions. Both anxiety and depression are not permanent mental health conditions. For example, one may be diagnosed with depression in their youth, but as they get older, as they grow, as they age, as they change, they may find that they no longer suffer from depression. They may find that they no longer feel depressed. Those who are diagnosed with anxiety may feel very anxious at some point in their lives, but they also may progress out of it. Not to say that you can grow out of a mental condition. You cannot grow out of depression. You cannot grow out of anxiety, but you can progress past it. Those who suffer from anxiety and depression do not suffer from these always for a lifetime. There is hope. If you are depressed, if you are anxious, there is hope for you, and you may progress out of these mental conditions. These are not permanent conditions. On the other hand, bipolar disorder and schizophrenia are both permanent. So once diagnosed with either one of these conditions, the person will have them forever. The person may not always experience symptoms, but eventually they will return. So, for example, you cannot progress out of bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. You may not always experience delusions. You may not always experience hallucinations. You may not hallucinate for years. You may not be delusional for years, but eventually the hallucinations will return. The delusions will return. The paranoia will return. Now, that's not to say that these conditions are not manageable. Bipolar disorder and schizophrenia are manageable with therapy, with medication, with self-care. So you don't have to be worried just because you're diagnosed with a mental condition that it's not the end of the world. But you do need to know and accept that once receiving one of these diagnoses, it's not going to go away. You cannot progress past these mental conditions. They are permanent, but they are manageable. Lastly, schizophrenia is the only one of the 4 mental conditions that we mentioned which feature hallucinations. Now, we defined hallucinations earlier in the video, so we already know what they're about, but this is the only one where hallucinations is a common symptom. If you are experiencing hallucinations and you are not diagnosed with schizophrenia, you should definitely see a mental health professional. It could be a medication that you are using. It could be anything. So if you are not diagnosed as a schizophrenic, but you know you're seeing and hearing things that are not there, you need to check in with a mental health professional very quickly, because it could be anything, or you could just be schizophrenic and just be not diagnosed yet. So hallucinations are a very serious aspect of schizophrenia, and that is the main difference between schizophrenia and everything else. I have personally been diagnosed with 3 out of the 4 of these mental conditions. I have been diagnosed with depression, bipolar disorder, and anxiety. I have never been clinically diagnosed as schizophrenic, so I know that is not what I am. But at some point in my life, I have experienced extreme depression, extreme anxiety, and now my main mental condition is bipolar disorder. I used to be very depressed to the point where I could barely get out of bed, to the point where I could barely leave my house. I was depressed to the point where I have attempted to take my own life. I have also experienced anxiety to the point where I was unable to talk to people. I was unable to, again, leave my house because of my anxiety was so bad. Where I am today, I accept the fact that I have bipolar disorder. I know that that is a mental condition that I have. I have progressed out of depression. I have progressed out of anxiety. Not to say that because I have bipolar disorder, I will always experience symptoms of depression. I will always get down. I will always feel my lows. But depression as a state of being, as a state of mind, is no longer an issue that I have. I still suffer from some anxiety, but I have progressed out of my anxiety in general, I can say. In general, I don't have very bad anxiety. I still suffer from social anxiety. It's hard for me to interact when I'm within groups of people that I don't know. I do still suffer from social anxiety, whereas before I had generalized anxiety. I was anxious about any and everything. So now I can say my anxiety is 100% better, but it's still there. As far as the hallucinations, I'm so happy that I learned that lithium was giving me hallucinations, because if I did not learn or figure that out, I would have continued taking that medication and it would have continued to have a very negative effect on me. That's it for today's video. I hope it was informative. All the definitions I gave today can be found on dictionary.com or simply by Googling. Please like, subscribe, turn on your notifications if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.